I always considered myself a practical police officer. Years of service taught me to deal with the worst of humanity, and I learned not to be easily shaken. That night, my routine was the same: strong coffee, radio tuned to emergency channels, and a stack of paperwork to fill out. Nothing I hadn't faced 1,000 times before. But something that night was about to break the monotony. The call came around 3 in the morning, that dead hour when even criminals seem to sleep. "Central, this is Unit 127. What's the emergency?" My voice sounded calm, as always, but what came from the other side chilled me to the bone. "Please, help me. He's coming. He's here." The voice was of a little girl, fragile and desperate. "Who's there with you? Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep calm, but the line went silent for a moment. The only thing I heard was a crackling noise, like someone was fiddling with the phone. He's going to get me. I don't want to die." Her voice sounded so real, so full of fear, that for a moment, I felt my heart race. "Stay calm, I'll help you. Tell me where you are." But before she could answer, the line went dead. The silence on the radio was deafening, as if time itself had stopped. My hands trembled slightly as I checked the call trace. "Come on, where are you?" I murmured to myself. Within seconds, the location appeared on the screen: an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, known for being the setting of ghost stories told by teenagers to scare each other. But that night, I wasn't in the mood for jokes. When I arrived, the house looked even more sinister under the moonlight. The crumbling structure, broken windows, and a palpable sense of abandonment. I turned off the engine and got out of the car, hand on my gun, eyes scanning the area. Every step I took made the wooden floor creak as if the house was protesting my presence. I carefully opened the front door. It creaked in protest, and the smell of mold and decay hit me like a punch. "Police!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty walls. No response. Only the distant sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the house. I started searching every room, my heart pounding. Deep down, a small part of me hoped to find the girl. But as I checked each empty room, that hope dwindled. Finally, I reached the basement, the last place to check. I descended the stairs, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The place was filled with old junk and debris, but nothing indicating recent presence. When I finally left, the sun was starting to rise. I was alone. I returned to the car, frustrated and confused. The girl's words still echoed in my head: "He's coming." But the house was empty, just like my hope of finding any answers. I reported the incident to the station and returned to the precinct, trying to understand what could have happened. I thought it was just another night on duty, another bizarre story to tell. But little did I know, it was just the beginning. At the precinct, the case was quickly dismissed as either a bad joke or a system error. Colleagues laughed, suggesting that I had been the target of some bored teenager's prank. I tried to laugh along, but something about the little girl's voice continued to bother me. There was an authenticity to that fear that I couldn't ignore. Maybe I was becoming sensitive with age, but the image of the abandoned house and the desperate cry of that girl wouldn't leave me alone. Days later, things returned to normal, or at least I tried to believe that. But then, at the same fateful time, the radio crackled again. "This is Unit 127, I answered, almost without thinking. "Please, help me. He's here." The same voice. The same girl. This time, my skin crawled. It wasn't a prank. "Stay where you are, I'm on my way." I didn't wait for permission or instructions. I just turned on the sirens and headed to the house. Every minute on the road felt like an eternity. Her words echoed in my head. Who was this he? And how did the girl keep calling from that seemingly empty house? I arrived at the scene faster than before. The house was exactly as I remembered, dark, deserted, and surrounded by an aura of abandonment. I entered once more, the echoes of my footsteps filling the silence of the place. I called for the girl, but there was no response. My heart pounded. I went upstairs, checking each room, every corner. Nothing. I went down to the basement again. Each step seemed to drag me further into a darkness that wasn't just physical. The flashlight barely illuminated the space ahead of me. Then, suddenly, a sound. A faint scratching, like nails on concrete. My senses sharpened, blood rushing faster through my veins. I followed the sound to a corner of the basement where a pile of debris was stacked. I started moving things, but soon the sound stopped, and whatever was there disappeared. I left the house, sweating cold, with a sense that something very wrong was happening. This time, I couldn't let it go. I decided to ask the few neighbors in the area. Most either didn't know or didn't want to talk about the house, calling it that old haunted house. But one resident, an elderly man who had lived on the street for decades, offered more information. He told me that years ago, the house had been the scene of a horrific crime. A woman and her daughter had been brutally murdered there. The daughter, Lindsay Florence, was only 8 years old. The killer was never caught. The details were hazy, and the man seemed uncomfortable discussing the matter, but the mention of the name Lindsay made something snap inside me. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I returned to my car, the name Lindsay Florence burning in my mind. The calls, the girl's voice, the house, everything began to align in a disturbing way. I started to consider the possibility that the case was far from being just a simple prank or system error. Perhaps there was something more sinister at play, something that went beyond what I considered possible. And so, my curiosity and, I must admit, a touch of fear led me to dig deep into the investigation of what really happened in that house. I needed answers, even if the truth was more terrifying than I could imagine. The little girl's calls continued, always at the same time, as if she knew exactly when I would be at the precinct, ready to answer. Every time the phone rang, my heart would race, and a part of me feared what I would hear next. Her voice, which had once sounded desperate and lost, began to take on a strange calmness, as if she had accepted her fate. "My name is Lindsay Florence," she said in one of those calls. "He's back. He's going to finish what he started." The revelation was a punch to the gut. The little girl calling was the same Lindsay Florence who was murdered years ago. And who was he? A chill ran down my spine, an ancient fear that seemed to arise from somewhere deep within. Each call increased the sense that I was dealing with something far beyond my control. Determined to uncover the truth, I began to delve into the old Florence case files. The crime scene photos were horrific, the mother's body found in the kitchen, stabbed multiple times, while Lindsay was found in the basement, her face frozen in an eternal scream. The killer left few clues, and the case quickly went cold. As I read the reports, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Small details in the neighbors' testimonies and the evidence suggested that the killer knew the victim's routines. He had waited patiently, studying, planning. I began to wonder if he was still out there, perhaps watching from afar, or worse, preparing to strike again. That's when the supernatural events began. It all started with fleeting visions, like shadows at the corner of my eye. I was at home, flipping through the files, when I saw a small, indistinct figure passing by the door. I quickly got up, but no one was there. A chill spread through the room, and for a moment, the air felt heavy, hard to breathe. The visions intensified. I was driving to work when I saw a little girl standing on the sidewalk, staring at me. When I blinked, she was gone. Another time, while searching the abandoned house once more, I heard a low laugh, almost a whisper, coming from the basement. The feeling of being watched was constant, as if something or someone was following me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. At home, objects began to move on their own. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I rushed to check, but the house was empty. In the morning, I found one of my favorite mugs broken on the kitchen floor. My hands trembled as I cleaned up the shards. There was no rational explanation for what was happening, and it terrified me more than anything. I was being pulled into something I couldn't understand. Lindsay's voice, the details of the case, and now these inexplicable phenomena, everything pointed to a truth I didn't want to accept, that I might be dealing with something beyond human comprehension. More and more, I felt that Lindsay herself was trying to show me something, guide me to a revelation that would change everything. And, in the meantime, the shadow of her killer loomed over us, like a storm ready to burst. The little girl's calls became increasingly urgent. "He's back," she said in the last call, her voice a whisper of panic. "He's here, in my house." I knew I was acting recklessly, but the sense of urgency was overwhelming. I couldn't let the killer escape again. He was out there, and I felt that if I didn't catch him, more blood would be spilled. I didn't inform my superiors, fearing they might remove me from the case or, worse, treat it as a personal obsession. This was my fight, and I was determined to face it alone. That night, armed and prepared for the worst, I returned to the abandoned house. The place was darker than ever, the shadows seemed to writhe like serpents in the weak moonlight. Every step I took echoed like a drum in the night's silence. The wind blew cold, as if the very air was charged with tension. When I entered, a deathly silence enveloped me. I slowly climbed the stairs, each creak of the floor sounding like a scream. On the second floor, something was different. A faint light came from the end of the hall, a door that I knew had been locked during previous visits was now ajar. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding like an uncontrollable drum. I opened the door with my gun drawn, and there he was. The killer, a tall, lean figure with eyes that gleamed in a way that made my blood run cold. He stood there, looking at me as if he already knew of my arrival, a ghastly smile on his face. "I was expecting you," he said, his voice smooth and cold like steel. For a moment, I was paralyzed. The room was decorated with photos of the victims, like a shrine to his own madness. The confrontation was quick and brutal. He lunged, a glint of the knife reflecting the dim light. I fired, the sound of the bullet echoing through the house. But he was fast, dodging and lunging again. We fought, the violence of the battle marked by blows and screams. I managed to subdue him, but not without paying a price. He managed to cut my arm. The pain was sharp, but adrenaline kept me standing. With a final effort, I managed to restrain him and disarm him. The killer laughed, a horrible sound that resonated in my head. "You'll never understand," he whispered as I handcuffed him. The look in his eyes was pure insanity, a void that made me question everything I thought I knew about evil. I called for backup, and they took him away, but the mark of that night stayed with me. I stayed in the house, alone, trying to process what had happened. I felt a heavy weight, as if all the darkness of that place was closing in on me. The little girl's calls, Lindsay's voice, everything came back to my mind. Were the calls a way to lead me to him? Or was it something darker, a manifestation of a restless spirit seeking revenge? As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the broken windows, I wondered if I was truly hearing Lindsay's ghost or if it was all a manifestation of my own need for justice. The questions haunted me. Who was really making those calls? And why me? I left the house feeling a strange sense of incompleteness, as if a part of the story was still left to be revealed. Life returned to normal, or at least, I tried to make it so. But the experience changed me. The images of that night, the killer's empty eyes, and Lindsay's desperate voice stayed with me. I never received the little girl's calls again. Perhaps her mission was complete, or perhaps I never really understood what happened. Thus, the story ended, but the mystery of Lindsay Florence and the mysterious calls remained. I had faced evil, but I came away with more questions than answers, a reminder that some truths, no matter how disturbing, can never be fully understood.